Today's guest on the Noetic Conversation series is a luminous individual. Her name is Dr. Souris. She holds a PhD in Justice, Law, and Society with a specialization in political theory from American University. She also teaches at American, where she routinely receives high marks for her teaching and won a prestigious teaching award. She has published and lectured widely on the subject of child soldiering. I could go on and on about the many virtues of this scholar. Her writing is as clear as a bell, while at the same time academically rigorous. She has devoted her intellect and energies to an issue that we don't understand enough in this country. It's likely best for me to shut up and let her sketch the contours of her tremendous paper, Child Soldiering on Trial, an interdisciplinary analysis of responsibility within the Lord's Resistance Army. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Souris.
Thank you very much.
So, my first question, all right? For those of us who may not know, can you give us some historical and political background to child abduction and soldiering in Africa? And perhaps tell us something about this situation, how it provoked a philosophical question within you.
Absolutely. Well, the first thing to know, Luke, is that child soldiering is not a monolithic phenomenon. Child soldiers are, some are recruited coercively, others are abducted, some actually volunteer. And so what I've done is I've tried to create some sort of categories to help systematize a little bit the experiences in Africa. And I typically divide the experiences into both the mode of recruitment and the methods of retention. And I have studied 4 different conflicts in Africa, one based in Liberia, one in Mozambique, one in Sierra Leone, and one in Uganda. And I have found actually that the experiences in Sierra Leone and Uganda are the most extreme in terms of both the mode of recruitment, primarily using abduction, as well as the methods of retention, using a lot of coercion and indoctrination within isolation in order to keep child soldiers within the group.
Now so that's incredibly fascinating. That I don't think a lot of Americans grasp that it isn't as monolithic as is perhaps portrayed in the media. Like I'm sure like individuals are familiar with like Kony and those movements and whatnot. I guess maybe if you could sketch a little bit more and sort of refine those categories, and maybe we're not so much doing advocacy today, but talk about how you hone in your paper in a particular group and what philosophical problems you find in that particular conflict. So if you could speak to that just a little bit more, if you give us a few more details and why it's philosophically interesting that you chose to focus on what you focused.
Absolutely. So the group that I do study the most is the Lord's Resistance Army from Uganda. The group came into being, I think, in the mid-1980s, and it was developed out of a thwarted revolutionary movement. So originally there was a lot of popular support to fight the government and take over because the government was not really supporting the people. But then a new president came into power, and so the revolutionary movement lost support. But then it turned into the Lord's Resistance Army because some of the individuals in the group did not want to give up the fight, essentially. And so that is the Lord's Resistance Army as we know it today under Joseph Kony. Came into existence in the 1980s. And because it lost popular support, it ended up having to abduct people to fight in its ranks and use violence and coercion in order to sustain its ranks to even mount any type of offensive against the government.
Can you clarify those means and methods of abduction? Because I think what's going to be instrumental in having a philosophical understanding of the issues at the heart of your paper are the means that Kony employs to abduct and force people and coerce individuals into his army. So tell me a little bit about that.
So a lot of the methods that they use would be called press ganging. So the group would enter an orphanage or a school. Typically, kind of the most disadvantaged portions of the society would be vulnerable to abduction. And the Lord's Resistance Army will come in and round up children, essentially, and bring them into a public area, a public square in front of people, and give them a machete or give them a gun and say to a child, kill your mother or kill your friend or kill this person. And there has been so many documented accounts that if a child refuses, he or she will be killed immediately. And so that makes the future compliance of other children more likely. And so this process is routine. This is not an extraordinary thing, which is why the group is so notorious, is that this is essentially the way in which that they get child soldiers to be within their ranks. And so it's very violent and it's very public. And this is also one of the problems that complicates the status of these children, is now that they're kind of branded within their communities as guilty as now complicit. But yet, philosophically speaking, I've asked in my research whether or not it's unreasonable to expect a child to basically sacrifice their life so as to avoid killing an innocent person. Typically, duress does not excuse homicide, but that is for an ordinary adult. And what can we reasonably expect from a child of 10 years old? And there are also instances too where the child's own parent will say, kill me to save yourself. And in this moment, this like heated moment, a child is crying, a parent is crying, and the child kills the parent. Sometimes the community doesn't want to welcome the child back, even if the child successfully manages to escape at some point and return back to the community. They're then shunned and might even return back to the group. And so philosophically, there are a lot of issues that are bound up with this moment of recruitment, this moment of abduction, as well as the subsequent initiation acts which follow.
Now that's what I'm particularly interested in. Personally, I don't find it too philosophically problematic, and maybe because I haven't meditated on it like you have. If a child goes and does something heinous and unethical, such as murder, if they're like 11 years old or something like that, like I can only imagine if you're being an 11-year-old and you're forced and you're coerced through incredibly heinous acts of violence, that, I mean, how could you really be held culpable for that? You barely have a sense for what's right and wrong, really, in a grown-up sense of that word at that age. What's more interesting to me is the subtle erosion of the freedom of the will, right? So you've got these international law standards, right, that say that a person can be held accountable for the atrocities that they do against humanity if they're, say, 16, 17, 18 years old. I don't know, maybe you can speak to the clarity of that, like which conventions we're talking about. So like when we do later on, when these individuals are 25 years old, and let's say they've been indoctrinated and gone through the Stockholm Syndrome and all the violence and everything like that, and they become these very good soldiers for Kony or whoever else, at some point, is there an erosion of free will, and how do we prosecute these individuals, and why that might be philosophically problematic? Because it seems like we could very well be dealing with adults who never went through proper ethical development, therefore holding them accountable in a war zone or prosecuting them for war crimes seems slightly absurd. So and that seems to be the real philosophical tension in your work, and the thing that I find so fascinating, and I guess I'd want to know what your findings are on the freedom of the will, and if you have a sort of lens on how to unknot this knot.
Right, okay. Well, to go back to your first claim, I don't think it's problematic to say that we should excuse a child for killing somebody at this first moment of their association with a group like the Lord's Resistance Army. And I think a lot of Western moral theorists would think that that's not problematic either, but actually some of these cultures, and being that it's international criminal law that I'm concerned with, has to be attentive to the cultural differences. And in some societies, they have no problem saying that a 10 or 11-year-old would be responsible for an act like that. And in our own society, too, you could be 7 years old and administratively transferred to the adult system. So we have this kind of ideology that if you do an adult crime, you pay adult time. So although I think most moral theorists would agree with the intuition that you started your question with, it's still not as clear-cut. But I do think the more philosophically interesting dynamic is the erosion of, free will, as you called it, or the failure to develop the capacities that we attribute to ordinary adults that make it reasonable to say they're responsible for what they do. And this occurs through a process that is very systematic and actually cleverly manipulated. And so the Lord's Resistance Army will ultimately follow a lot of the type of tactics that most military groups do. So they will kind of try to break down individuality, give someone a war name, and this is done with the child soldiers, and strip them of their previous lives and really bind them to the group. Instead of trying to build camaraderie, though, the Lord's Resistance Army tries to undermine trust from forming among child soldiers, and tries to...
Because they have to look out for themselves, right? If they bond to anybody else and anyone else is insubordinate or anything like that, then that would create division within this mass.
Right, or a coup. They can want to take over. And so Konys Power is really exercised by this kind of divide and conquer mentality within his own ranks. And so it's, there's a hierarchy, but it's essentially the new recruits are really subject to surveillance. They're put in a chain gang where their legs are tied together with barbed wire for a certain period of time after being isolated in the jungle, so that if they wanted to escape, they'd have to literally cut through their leg in order to do so. Kony also notoriously mutilates their faces and whatnot, so if they do happen to escape once the barbed wire is no longer tying them together, that they have this mark on them, this stigmatizing mark that anywhere they go, people in Africa will be aware that they have, been associated with Kony and have probably carried out some atrocities at this point. And so there are a variety of both, physical markings that are inflicted upon them, as well as just the the moral markings that are made to the developing child through this period of indoctrination, where they are forced to kill innocent people. And they learn essentially that they have to play by the rules if they want to survive, and that their only hope of security, they are taught and come to believe, is within the group. And so they end up adopting the ideology of the group because of the combination of coercion and isolation and socialization. It's a very, very powerful confluence of factors that leads these children to kind of develop the mindset and the ideology that Kony's platform puts forth.
Now, I know it's a very straightforward question. You're probably going to have to say, hold up there. I'm going to have to get into some of the details or whatever. But do you believe that those tactics actually fully erode free will? And if the answer is ambiguous, you've developed a little bit of a framework by drawing on the works of Aristotle, and I'm thinking particularly his distinction between voluntary, non-voluntary, and involuntary action, to perhaps give us a little bit of an ethical orienting framework for figuring out how to praise and assign blame and things like that to individuals, even though they've undergone all this duress that's been systematically imposed upon them since they were tweens.
Okay, so you raise a question. The issues related to free will and responsibility have been studied for centuries and very difficult. Aristotle, however, didn't believe in, I think, free will, that concept of free will that we think about today. I mean, he believed in something similar, that we had some sort of ability through voluntary action to kind of carve out our characters and develop certain habits, and that we were more free by virtue of the fact that we acted voluntarily. But I think the notion of free will that you might have in mind, if I'm correct, it would be anachronistic to apply that to Aristotle's framework. I think that kind of developed in later centuries.
When I think about, and it's been a while since I've done my Nicomachean Ethics or whatever, so I tend to think of voluntary actions, things we consciously choose, and involuntary action, if I'm correct, are things that are like automatic, like breathing maybe, or something like that. And then there's this weird category for Aristotle of mixed or non-voluntary, which is like, if someone puts a gun to my head and tells me to do something, in a way I might be able to be exonerated, but also held accountable at the same time.
Right.
So and I kind of thought, well, maybe that's the situation that these child soldiers are in. Even though they may be 25 years old and it's sort of translated into the realm of ethical adulthood. If the Aristotelian methodology for diagnosing the situation of these children is not appropriate, I'd like to hear why you think it isn't appropriate. What paradigm ought we be to applying to this scenario?
Well, I think the Aristotelian model is appropriate, more so than the Kantian model, which I think free will is more kind of a central concept. Free will, to me, is akin to autonomy, and I think that's the locus of a Kantian notion of responsibility. It's that you're responsible insofar as you're rational and you're autonomous, and you can exercise what I think in the contemporary scholarship is called reflective self-control. You can kind of choose to act against your inclinations, against your desires, because of your grasp of moral principles, that they require you to do that. I think Aristotle is helpful because Aristotle emphasizes habit and character. And he says that our upbringing right from youth makes all of the difference, right, in the type of adults that we become. And so he emphasizes that it's exceptionally important to focus on moral character of children, because the actions that they perform over time will lead to the type of adult they are. And for Aristotle, we actually become less free as we grow older. I think for a Kantian model, we become more free as we grow older. And I think Aristotle's model has a lot of support from contemporary moral psychology that shows that what we do over time really does kind of hardwire aspects of our brain that makes us more likely to act in those ways as we grow older, and it becomes harder to act differently. And I think that this is something intuitive to anybody. The habits that you have are hard to break, whether or not they're good or bad, as you age. But I do think an Aristotelian model is promising, and what I've done in my paper with the different categories of action is that Aristotle says we develop our characters through repeated voluntary actions over time. And you're right to say that mixed actions are those like performed under duress, when it's not really the agent choosing for its own sake to act a certain way, but rather a combination of perhaps force and maybe a little bit of ignorance is leading someone to choose one thing over another that he or she wouldn't otherwise choose if it wasn't the circumstances that he or she is in. So what I've done in my paper is try to examine child soldiers as having their characters form over time by performing mixed actions. So actions under duress seems to be the category of action that their characters are
Which is
formed.
super fascinating, because when I think of mixed action, I think of like a distinct episode, like the bank robbery situation where you have this total break of character. But for these individuals, that's all they know. Their entire life is mixed action.
Well, not their entire life. Certainly eating a sandwich or something, or going to sleep isn't a mixed action. But I think there are certain actions that have more value or weight in forming who we are than others. And certainly if you are killing somebody, that is going to leave more of a mark on you than something that would be more mindless. And so it's not that I've argued that every action they perform is a mixed action, but I think the ones that are going to be most formative and transformative in this process of turning them from children into soldiers are going to be of a mixed kind. They're not going to be fully involuntary because they're not going to be compelled. For Aristotle, an involuntary action is fully compelled. He gives an example of a man literally being carried away.
Right.
The man has
like a river sweeping you away.
Exactly. But if you perform an action because you're forced to perform it, for Aristotle, that's a mixed action. There's some element of voluntariness to it because you're choosing to do it, but it's not fully voluntary because you wouldn't choose it for its own sake. And so what I've done is argued that the actions that are performed under duress for these children, which seem to mark important moments in their formative years, seem to be those that are going to form the characters that they end up having as later adolescents and young adults. And you mentioned earlier, what is the stance in international law on the age of criminal responsibility? And so this is something my research also explores. There's no consensus on at what age a person could be criminally responsible. The International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over anyone under 18 years old, but Sierra Leone, I mentioned that conflict earlier, ultimately had jurisdiction. The Special Court of Sierra Leone had jurisdiction over anyone above 15 years old. The prosecutor chose not to exercise that jurisdiction, but there's some precedent in international law that it has been granted to prosecute someone who is 15, 16, or 17 years old. So this ambiguity that exists, I think, bleeds through international criminal law and creates the potential that there could be some sort of inconsistent response to individuals who commit crimes while they are, legal juveniles under the Rome statute, but under domestic jurisdictions too. There's very, very much disagreement. And so my work looks at, should there be more of a consensus? Should there be more of a coherent legal framework that could be used to evaluate the actions of these individuals while they're under 18, presumably from the point of recruitment to the point where they turn to be legal adults at 18 under the International Criminal Court. So we know how to evaluate the blameworthiness of what they're doing at each stage of the process of transition.
Okay, that's fascinating. We have to take a time out.
Okay.
And we're back. So the question that I have for you now is, you mentioned that there ought to be a consensus, right? There ought to be a consensus. And I guess I'm curious as to, does Aristotle help us shape the consensus for how to deal with individuals who are apprehended after they've reached an age of maturation in child soldiering, or if they're still underage? How is philosophy shaping that consensus? If Aristotle isn't the answer, is there another rubric that we ought to be using? Or is it something that philosophy has no real say in? Is it just really about building consensus amongst tribal mores and international standards and what the US thinks? How do we build that consensus about how to resolve this situation of assigning blameworthiness?
Well, I think that it's a very difficult problem because the law has to draw bright lines, right? It has to create categories because it has to be able to be applied in practice. And I think, probably the most philosophically desirable approach would be one that would be difficult to apply. You also have to pay attention to cultural differences.
Can you say what the philosophical approach would be?
It would probably be one that took into account a lot of nuance, a lot of individualized factors. I think, philosophically speaking, ethically speaking, we'd want to address a particular perpetrator knowing as much as possible about that person in order to determine whether or not they were morally responsible.
So if I had person A, who is 17 years old, would I go and I do this case-by-case analysis, and I take my Aristotle with me to take in all the factors? And then when I've got a person who's 26 years old, take my Aristotle with me and apply them to that particular situation? Or do I have a blend of philosophical, ethical theories, and do you see them integrative at all? I mean, I'm essentially asking you for a grand unified system
I wish I had it.
But I don't know, is that kind of how you imagine it working, or are there other factors besides Aristotle that affect the case-by-case analysis?
Absolutely. So I think Aristotle I've been used kind of as a guiding understanding of how to evaluate the moral responsibility of child soldiers and perhaps adult soldiers who were recruited as children. However, Aristotle provides for me a moral background, but the criminal law also has different aims, right? Moral responsibility is about what judgments are correct from a moral point of view. Like when are we warranted in blaming someone morally? But our reactive attitudes of blaming someone morally don't have the high stakes that the criminal law does. And so the criminal law has to take into account certainly other aims and goals, like deterrence, for example, and prevention, and what's going to promote peace. And so, yeah, I would like to say that there are probably a confluence of different moral theories that one would want to keep in mind in addressing this problem.
Can you itemize those?
Yeah, like I think
audience?
I find that utilitarian concerns are very relevant. Utilitarianism, as applied to the criminal laws, we designed this institution. It's a human institution to serve the purposes of crime prevention, and so I think that you can't ignore the problem of crime prevention. You also have to be aware of rehabilitation. You're dealing with individuals who, I have argued, are really harmed developmentally speaking. And so you can't simply just put them back into society and subject other more innocent people to the risk that they would be victimized by dangerous people who have been developmentally harmed. So I think from a rehabilitation perspective, you have to look at what are the consequences, what are the likelihood that these individuals who were harmed could be rehabilitated and return to the community as productive members of society. Although I find that the Kantian approach is a little bit problematic in assuming that simply because someone is an adult that they would be capable of adult capacities. I think Kant's view, you can't eradicate Kant's view, because I think the Kantian notion of selfhood and autonomy is a foundation of the criminal law. And although the International Criminal Court isn't an entirely Western model, it still largely incorporates Western elements of criminal law. And so one needs to be aware of the instrument that we're working with, and I think it's a broadly Kantian understanding of free will and responsibility that the criminal law embodies. And so one needs to be aware of that instrument to understand the ways in which I think it's kind of a blunt instrument. And so the Aristotelian developmental model can help add a little bit of nuance to our understanding of how to apply that law to particular cases. But certainly I think that attention to wider factors, cultural factors, and as I said, prospects for rehabilitation are exceptionally important and ethically necessary considerations in dealing with this problem.
Maybe I've developed too much of a fetish for prosecution.
Okay,
and
perhaps.
fixated too much on that. And there's more to this issue than just where we draw the lines, right? And there might be, I think, something really philosophically interesting when we bring people back into society.
Mm-hmm.
You've spoken a little bit about rehabilitation. I was wondering if you could say if there's anything philosophically interesting about how we restore. Let's just say that all these individuals have had their autonomy compromised and they aren't free agents, and that we give them a pass because of a horrendous scenario that we're in. There's got to be this competing other sort of ethical claim where we can usher them back into society, mm-hmm. where we can restore that autonomy. It's not just, we don't just have the ethical imperative to prosecute, but also to heal.
Right.
So what may be philosophically interesting about the process of rehabilitation? Have you found anything interesting in that respect?
Yes, but first I'm going to disagree with you. I don't think we have an ethical requirement to prosecute individuals. I think there is a sort of fetishism with prosecution, and I think that stems from a deeper need to hold people accountable. And I don't think that prosecution and punitive responses are the only way to hold individuals accountable in society. Although it has been shown that in order to develop a responsible person, you have to hold them responsible. And we know this. We see the way we raise our children in ordinary societies. We hold them responsible for acts, hoping that by doing so, they will therefore become responsible and will not need external controls and can hold them responsible themselves as they age. And so I do think that some form of accountability is needed. And so rehabilitation has been shown to be successful with child soldiers from Sierra Leone, which is a very good comparison case because the experiences were quite similar with child soldiers in Uganda. And it has been shown that through psychosocial support and community and or family acceptance, child soldiers have been able to successfully reintegrate back into society and desist from violence. However, where those are absent, unfortunately, some of the child soldiers that have ended up turning to street crime or have been recruited up by actually government forces to fight for them. And now that they're above 18 years old, there's no ethical qualms there, essentially.
Can you speak perhaps a little bit, I'm sorry
yes.
if I cut you off there a little bit, But could you speak a little bit to the restorative acts? Like, what are the particular things that individuals are doing to get them to leave that life behind that makes them sort of sense that form of accountability when it's not necessarily punitive? Holding someone responsible, but at the same time not infantilizing them. How do we get them back into that realm of adulthood? There's specific techniques. And the reason why I want to dwell on this a little bit is because I feel like it could be analogous to so many other international conflicts and problems within American society and stuff like that. So I think it'd be really illuminating in that respect.
So there are, to introduce my answer, there are broadly like two relevant kind of theories of punishment that are at play here. One is rehabilitation, which I've mentioned. Rehabilitation focuses more on kind of morally neutral skills that you could teach somebody. For example, the psychosocial support that I mentioned doesn't really try to get at the moral harm that was done to individuals, but rather has them kind of talk about it and kind of through a cathartic moment really just share what they've done and recognize that through like a legitimate job opportunity or being welcomed back into the community, they can have a new life. And so it's more of a liberal model, I think, to bring someone back in. Another theory is moral reform, and moral reform is typically associated with a punitive response, but I'm actually arguing in a new piece that I'm writing that you could introduce a type of moral reform into these individuals where they do morally have to address what they have done and come to see what they have done as being wrong, while not necessarily then following that up with a punitive response, like not following it up with
I'm fascinated. Is it like Clockwork Orange? I mean, how do they? I'm fascinated what techniques they might use in order to introduce this notion that the way that they were living their life is all wrong, and they need to come see the world entirely differently. Like, are they prying their eyes open and making them watch films?
A lot of it, I think, is establishing those types of relationships that they were deprived of as children and as adolescents, and showing them that they can trust people. And so removing the type of violence and coercion from their life. And so a lot of it does require instilling a sense of empathy in these individuals, having them feel shame for the right things, having them feel guilt for the right things, because part of what is done through the systematic process of manipulation in the transition from child to soldier is a distortion of their emotions. And so, you know, as their child soldiers, they might be beaten for showing sympathy or compassion. If they cry because they're scared, they'll be beat.
Right.
And so they grow up to be these adults that can't feel emotions at the right sorts of things. And so part of what the response that has been shown to be very successful in having them desist from violence and return to the community successfully has been instilling a sense of trust with the relationship that they might not have had, establishing acceptance of the community, and having them come to experience emotions the way that law-abiding people typically experience them, which is, violence, should make you sad or upset or whatnot.
What I love about this conversation is we've gone from the legalistic to a very heartfelt sort of plea for restoration of individuals. I think we've gone from the theoretical to the emotional quite well throughout this whole process. And I guess the question I would have, because I probably do need to draw this a little to an end here, is who are the organizations, the institutions that are doing these rehabilitative efforts, and perhaps how can the audiences at home contribute to the restoration of individuals into functioning members of their societies?
Okay. I'm less familiar actually with the advocacy groups. I know Human Rights Watch does a lot of work. I know Amnesty International does a lot of work with child soldiers, or advocating for child soldiers to be treated like victims and to be given rehabilitation. I'm more familiar with the field researchers that have worked with social scientists and other type of clinical workers. So I'm familiar with, like, Teresa Betancourt has done a tremendous amount of work, pioneering work in rehabilitation. And so I'm more familiar with kind of the academic bodies of literature. Although there are countless organizations that look at child soldiering, recognize the grave damage that could be done through child soldiering, and so tries to have relief efforts. And a lot of them really focus on rehabilitation for demobilized child soldiers who are trying to remove the causes of child soldiering, right? So the etiology of child soldiering is a very often studied topic. And so what impels children to join, if they're not abducted, as I know some, as I mentioned, some are actually volunteering for these groups. And so how do we prevent that? And so advocacy groups focus on trying to remove the causes and controlling the effects. And There are a host of organizations.
Well,
out
you
there.
mentioned Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. I guess I'm sort of curious because I know that the church has grown a good deal in Africa. Do you know, are religious institutions doing anything in regards to Reformation, in regards to Kony or in Sierra Leone or anything like that?
I'm sure they are. I know that certainly Uganda is a very religious country. I know that Joseph Kony too manipulates children because he says that he.
He's like Jesus reincarnated.
Exactly. He says
right?
he actually claims that he's trying to build a Ugandan based on the Ten Commandments. Although his understanding of what the Ten Commandments involved is quite, I think, perverted. Based on what our understanding of the Ten Commandments would be. But ultimately, I think that the church, from my understanding, tends to be a little bit more punitive than the advocacy groups that I'm familiar with. But I haven't done a lot of research in that area.
I'd be curious, because if you have these different advocacy groups, religious organizations sort of jockeying to rehabilitate these people, if that could sort of cascade other issues, if there's any opportunity for radicalization or anything like that, it's a situation that's so fluid and you have so many different people sort of trying to do this different type of moral inculcation. We want to be careful about them, if they're going to exchange one set of morals for another, that it's going to be one that leads to human flourishing.
Right, exactly.
And not radicalization in a different way. So I'm curious if there might be cults or sects or anything else in there that might see these child soldiers as like another target for them, as a way to co-opt and grow their particular movement.
Well, certainly we see that with ISIS, right?
Yeah.
I mean, ISIS is using their religiosity in order to build what they're calling the caliphate cubs and breed a new generation that will promote the jihad ideology. And that's a separate issue. I mean, ISIS is unique in its own right. You have to understand the historical, social, political background to understand ISIS and its role today. But certainly ISIS is a big threat using child soldiers and using child soldiers in a way that's manipulated very heavily with their religion. I don't think the way they understand their religion has been regarded as kind of mainstream. But nonetheless, there you do see the radicalization of children who are being taught to be soldiers with a particular religion.
Well, thank you so much. I think we have to bring this to a close.
Okay.
But it was a pleasure having you. Really, really enjoyed it.
All right, thank you very
so
much. I appreciate it.
All right.